Continuing our recent string of EV and plug-in hybrid reviews, we have gotten our hands on the 2018 Kia Niro plug-in. This is one of the most affordable vehicles you can buy in America with a plug. Basically what Kia did to create the Niro plug-in is they took the regular Niro hybrid, they gave it a more powerful electric motor under the hood, and then they gave it a bigger battery pack in the rear. But what's most surprising about this conversion into a plug-in is that they didn't affect the cargo space in the back at all. So we actually have the same amount of cargo space in the back as we do in the regular Niro. Now, Kia is calling the Niro a crossover. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. If you want to call this a crossover or if you want to call this a hatchback, that's up to you. But whatever you call it, the Niro will give you about 26 miles of EV range and about 46 miles per gallon afterwards. That's a little bit less than we find in the Toyota Prius Prime, but this is actually a little bit more practical overall than that Prius. I think it's also a little bit more attractive. Let me know what you think about that as well down there in the comment section below. Kia sent us the top-end trim of the Niro plug-in, so we have full LED headlamps up front. That is one of the differences between the plug-in and the regular hybrid, which gets HIDs in its top-end trim. We have a slight tweak to the front grille. We have a lot less cooling demands going on in the average hybrid and plug-in, so we have a very small opening right here in the center, and the rest of this is actually blanked off. We have fog lamps below that, and then some blue trim indicating this is the plug-in model. Outside of the fog lamps, we find small air vents on each side. This air vent helps reduce pressure up front as you're driving along and therefore helps improve fuel economy. As with the regular Niro hybrid, the plug-in model is 171.5 inches long. That means this is a subcompact vehicle in America. This is a little bit shorter than the Prius Prime because the Prius Prime is shaped more like a sedan. So the cargo area in this vehicle is a little bit square, a little bit more upright. The one in the Prius Prime is a little bit longer out the back. In terms of overall vehicle size, this is a little bit closer to the Honda HR-V than the Honda CR-V, but it slots in between those two models. This is just about the same size as the Ford C-Max, and for 2018, the Ford C-Max Energy has actually been discontinued, so it really is no longer direct competition to this model. Ford has actually recently said that all C-Max models are being discontinued, so not only is there no direct competition for this plug-in hybrid Niro from Ford, but there's also no direct competition for the regular hybrid Niro either anymore. While we're looking at the side, it's worth pointing out the tires, because in upper end trims of the regular Niro, they get wider tires, but that doesn't happen on the plug-in model in order to help improve efficiency overall. So these tires are essentially the same ones that we find on the base model of the regular hybrid Niro. And that means that handling in this top-end trim is not going to be as good as handling in the top-end trim of the regular Niro. The overall front and rear end styling is definitely a little bit more crossover than hatchback in America. Ground clearance is something of a debate, of course, because this has ground clearance that actually is not that far off something like a Toyota RAV4 or previous generation Honda CR-V, but it is not exactly tall for this segment. So you will find more ground clearance in something like a Subaru Crosstrek or, of course, a Jeep Renegade. But to be honest, the definition of crossover is a little bit nebulous anyway, and since most crossovers in America are sold as two-wheel drive vehicles, I actually don't necessarily see the problem with calling this a crossover, although I could also see calling this a hatchback. Under the Niro's hood, we find essentially the same hybrid system that we find in the Hyundai Ioniq. At its heart, we find a 1.6-liter four-cylinder engine that produces 104 horsepower and 109 pound-feet of torque. Then on the other side of the engine bay, we find a 60 horsepower motor that produces 125 pound-feet of torque. That motor is a little bit more powerful than the regular hybrid model, which produces 43 horsepower, about the same amount of torque. The electric motor is directly connected to a 6-speed dual-clutch transmission that we find on this side of the engine bay. That sends the power to the front wheels. The dual-clutch transmission was used because parasitic losses are lower than with a traditional automatic transmission. When everything is working together, we get 139 horsepower and 195 pound-feet of torque. As with many hybrids, you can't directly add the power figure for the electric motor and the engine together to come up with a total because they aren't producing their peak horsepower and peak torque at the same time. Battery capacity grows from about 1.5 kilowatt hours in the regular hybrid to 8.9 in this plug-in hybrid model. The battery pack is located in the back of the vehicle and charging happens via that port right up front. This will give you 26 miles of EV-only range and it'll take about 2.5 hours to charge if you have access to a level 2 charger. Because the Niro is shaped more like a crossover, fuel economy figures come in below the Ioniq, which has a more aerodynamic wedge-style profile like the Toyota Prius. That's why we get 105 mpge in this model and 46 mpg when operating as a hybrid. That compares to 133 mpge in the Prius Prime and 54 miles per gallon when that's operating as a hybrid because it's shaped more like that Ioniq. You might have noticed that hybrid mode fuel economy slots right between the most and least efficient regular hybrid Niros. That's again because of those tires that we have on this vehicle. The most efficient Niro is a little bit lighter than this, but it uses those same tires. The least efficient hybrid Niro uses much wider tires, and that's why it gets 43 miles per gallon combined. Front seat comfort comes in at 8 out of 10 points in the model we're driving. We have a power driver seat with two-way adjustable lumbar support. And I think these seats are just about as comfortable as what we find in the Toyota Prius Prime. These are a little bit more comfortable than the average seats in the mainstream compact crossover segment, but they're not quite as comfortable as the plug-in Honda Clarity, although the Honda Clarity is more expensive. We have a tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion, and a generous amount of headroom in all Niro models. Sitting very upright here, I still have about 3 inches of headroom left. Because of the boxy styling and the upright seating position we find in the Niro, headroom and legroom is quite generous. Although, interestingly enough, we actually find a little bit more headroom in the back of the Kia Soul. I still have about 2 inches left, sitting right back here, and about 2 inches of legroom sitting behind myself. If I move over to the right side of the vehicle, this front seat is all the way back in its tracks. I had a 6'5" passenger in the car. I have about 1 inch of legroom left. Generous legroom seems to be pretty typical in this segment because of the more upright seating position. However, you should know that if you plan on putting rear-facing child seats in the back of this vehicle, then front legroom definitely is going to be limited because you're going to have to push that front seat further forward in order to fit that child seat in the back. However, for regular adults, etc., the upright seating position helps make this feel more roomy. You should also note that this is not as wide as something like a Kia Sportage, and that's really obvious if you move into the middle seat. I still have a decent amount of headroom. However, this would be a little bit less comfortable if you had to put 3 adults across the back. Car companies have been getting better and better at locating hybrid battery packs in places where it doesn't impact cargo room. We see that in the new Accord, the new Camry, and in the new Niro as well. At 19.4 cubic feet, this is exactly the same amount of cargo space that we find in the regular Niro, even though we have a battery pack that's almost 8 times larger. This cargo area is essentially the same size as the Toyota Prius Prime at 19.8 cubic feet. However, this is actually shaped a bit more practically because it's definitely a little bit taller and it's also squarer. And the rear opening is definitely squarer as well. That means if you wanted to put large bulky items in your vehicle, this is going to be considerably more practical than the Prius Prime because if you fold down these rear seats, we have a cargo area that's again shaped like your average crossover. Keeping the cargo capacity the same wasn't a magic trick because you actually find the battery right here where the spare tire used to go. So you can get a spare tire in the hybrid Niro, but you cannot get one in the plug-in hybrid Niro because there's no room for one down here under the cargo area load floor. Instead, we get a tire mobility kit and an area where you can put your charge cord, etc. The rear cargo compartment is also where we find the 12-volt battery for the car. Just like most hybrids, this still has one. And we also find the subwoofer for the upgraded audio system. On the inside, we have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and the front passenger. The model that we're driving has this light gray leather upholstery. You can see right there that we have sort of a light teal stitching going on that again indicates that this is the plug-in hybrid model. The leather seats are perforated because these seats are both heated and ventilated. And you'll notice as we move on over to the door that this interior has sort of a two-tone style going on. We have a color that matches the seat upholstery there up top, sort of a light gray, and then more of a charcoal down there lower on the door. The upper section of the door is made from a soft touch plastic, lower section of the door is hard, and then we have a soft touch armrest right there with a large bottle holder below. Moving over to the dashboard, we find more of those teal accents around the air vents. The upper section of the dashboard is a soft touch plastic. The lower portions of the dashboard, including this tan section, are all hard plastics. On the passenger side, we have a bin-style glove compartment. I was barely able to fit a 10-inch tablet computer inside. Some larger computers may have troubles fitting. In the center of the dashboard, we have a color touchscreen infotainment system. The size of the screen does change based on which model that you're getting. Since we're in the top-end trim, we have the slightly larger display. As with basically every other Kia in America, the system features Apple CarPlay and Android Auto standard. That means that basically all models come standard with factory navigation as long as you have a compatible smartphone. If we go back to the Kia menus in the system, this is basically the same software we see in other Kias with factory navigation over here on this side, direct access to Apple CarPlay right over there. We also have the usual hybrid screens. We have a tree that grows depending on how ecologically you're driving. Since we've been spending a lot of time parked and filming, we get an Eco Level 4. We can see our fuel economy. We have an average here, and then we have our history over here on this side. You can also get an EV range display, very much like the average EV in America. That'll give you a little circle telling you how far it thinks you can go on electricity only. Charge settings, so you can tell the car when you want it to start charging, basically when power rates are lower. You can help find charging stations, gas stations, etc. And we have our pretty typical energy flow screen right here, and battery information. Give you your total range, electric range, gasoline range, and the expected charging time based on where we're starting right now. Below the LCD, we have the engine start-stop button, controls for that infotainment system, power volume, radio media track forward, backward, hazard light button. Under this little flap, we find the SD card for the mapping database. You'll see it right under there, if I can lift that out of the way, right like that. We also have a direct access button for the vehicle's map display, a nav button which takes us to the address input, setup, and then a favorites button. You'll find enter and tune right over here. Below that, we have the controls for the dual zone climate control system. There's a driver only button, which will cause the system to send air out of the driver's side vents only. That helps improve efficiency. Below the climate controls, we have two 12-volt power outlets, a USB input, auxiliary input, and a wireless charging mat if your phone supports Qi wireless charging. Of course, my particular phone does not. As you can see, this is sized appropriately for larger smartphones as long as they don't have a cable connected. Instead of a funky joystick shifter, Kia decided to use a very traditional console shifter. So drive is all the way back here towards the driver, sport mode is over to the left, and then you can engage manual mode by toggling up and down. The true manual mode is possible, of course, because unlike Toyota and Lexus hybrids, this vehicle actually uses a 6-speed transmission, so you can dictate what gear you want it to use right there in that sport mode. We then have a button to enable and disable the parking sensors, and a button to toggle between hybrid mode and EV mode. Behind that, we have a button for the heated steering wheel, heated and ventilated front seats, two large cup holders, and a small storage cubby next to it. Between the front seats, we find a padded armrest with more of that teal stitching going on. This opens to reveal a large storage compartment. There's a USB charge-only port inside. That one does not connect with the infotainment system. The instrument cluster is pretty typical for a hybrid vehicle. We have a power and charge gauge over here on the left. Off is right down here at the bottom. This blue range is charge. The green range is the eco range, and it also indicates roughly where the electric motor operation will be. Keep in mind we have just 60 horsepower from the electric motor, but it is enough to hill climb as long as you don't need to heat the cabin. The vehicle doesn't seem to want to use electricity in order to heat the cabin. On the right side, we have a traditional analog speedometer, and in the middle we have a color multifunction display. This display is where we find the battery state of charge and the battery range, and then of course the gasoline level and the gasoline range. Now personally, I found the battery display to be just a little bit tricky because the battery currently is at 44% charged, but according to this display, it looks like it might be about 50% charged. The upper left corner of the display is where we find the hybrid mode indication. That tells us that we're in hybrid mode rather than EV mode. We also have the exterior temperature right there. And then if I move the vehicle into sport mode, you'll notice this display changes because we now get an actual digital tachometer right here in the middle. Actually, I'll have a little line that will climb up there and it'll give you a digital readout there as well. So if I go ahead and start the engine, you'll notice that we have the RPMs right there. Since the vehicle's charging, it is a little bit higher than normal idle. We have that indication right over there. We also have the sport icon right over here on this side. If I move it back to drive, you'll notice that eco appears there instead. This display also gives us things like our trip computer information, an assessment of your driving style, whether you've been driving economically, normally, aggressively, etc. Gives you an energy flow display, engine temperature, and of course, average fuel economy. You can also see accumulated info. So for instance, over the last 303 miles, we've averaged about 52 miles per gallon. We've driven this car almost 500 miles total, and we have reset that at various times to try and get a better grip on exactly what the fuel economy was like. As with other Kia models, this display can also give you turn-by-turn navigation directions, the status of the vehicle's active safety systems, and you can adjust certain vehicle settings via this display as well. The steering wheel should be very familiar to you if you've driven any recent Kia models. We have sport grips up top. It's a 3-spoke design with this sort of split spoke at the bottom. The left side of the steering wheel is where we find infotainment controls, so volume up, down, and mute, voice command, mode button, track forward, backward, and then phone hang up and pick up. On the right side of the steering wheel, we find the cruise control buttons. So enable right there, cancel, distance, and then speed increase and decrease. And then this toggle and this button control that multifunction display that you can see between the power gauge and the speedometer. Thanks to the 60 horsepower electric motor under the hood, the Niro is capable of driving, in most situations, electric only, even climbing the hill that we're on right here. Now, admittedly, this hill climb happens a lot slower if you're in EV mode versus hybrid mode, because we don't get as much oomph out of the overall system. 0 to 60 happens in 9.5 seconds if the hybrid system has the gasoline engine engaged. Interestingly enough, that is exactly the same 0 to 60 time that we clocked in the regular hybrid Niro. The reason for that is likely that the power curve on this total drivetrain is a little bit different because we get that bigger battery, we get the more powerful electric motor, even though the combined total is actually the same. This is 1/10 of a second slower than the regular Prius, but actually about 0.8 of a second faster than the Prius Prime. It's worth noting that this plug-in hybrid has an electric air conditioning system, so it doesn't need to turn on the engine in order to cool the cabin. However, if you were to command more cabin heat, then the engine will turn on in order to heat the cabin. For instance, it's 49 degrees outside, I just set the system to auto, and 73 degrees for the interior temperature, and it turned on the engine. Now, the engine in this situation is not driving the wheels, although it is still generating electricity, sending that along to the vehicle's electrical system. It's basically just turning on in order to help heat the cabin. In situations like this, I've personally found it to be slightly more efficient if I just switch the vehicle over to hybrid electric mode, let it heat the engine up, use the engine to drive the vehicle forward, and then switch to EV mode a little bit later. I mentioned the cabin heating because this is a little bit different than some of the other plug-in hybrids out there. For instance, the Chevy Volt has a resistive element heater, so it will draw power from the battery, run a resistive element heater, and that heats water, and then that water goes around a loop and then actually ends up heating the cabin. In our braking tests, we stopped from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 126 feet. That is a little bit longer than the last Niro that we tested. Logically, because this weighs about 200 pounds more than that vehicle, but also because of the tires that we have on this car. Braking distance in this vehicle is quite similar to the Prius Prime and really not that far off the Chevy Volt either. The way that regen braking happens in the Niro is a little bit different than the Volt or the Prius, because this uses that 6-speed dual-clutch transmission, and the motor is on the other side of that transmission from the wheels. That means that power going back to that motor goes from the wheels through the transmission, then into the motor. So as you're slowing down, the transmission is actually downshifting from 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 as you come to a complete stop. Although smooth for a dual clutch transmission, you can feel those gear changes as the car decelerates. Overall handling is fairly good in the Niro, but keep in mind that we do have just 205 width tires on this car, not the wider tires we find in that top end trim of the regular hybrid. That means that overall handling is not going to be as good as something like a Ford C-Max Energy in some trims, or again the regular hybrid version of the Niro. Now, on the bright side, most of the weight increase that happens to turn this into a plug-in vehicle happens back there in the rear of the vehicle, and that does help balance out the weight a little bit, but this is not going to exactly be a corner carver. Now, keep in mind that the most direct competition to the Niro plug-in would be the Ioniq plug-in and the Prius Prime, and neither one of those vehicles are really going to be that much more engaging than this either. In some situations, the Chevy Volt is a little bit more engaging than the Niro plug-in, but it's not quite the same vehicle. The electric range is a little bit longer in that Volt, and it is designed to operate as a pure EV all the time. But it's also a hybrid, and that dual mission leaves it somewhat conflicted. When operating as a pure hybrid vehicle, I've been getting much better fuel economy in this Niro than we ever got in the Volt. The Volt ends up somewhere around the mid 30 miles per gallon range in our driving. This has been hovering right around 50. In terms of overall fuel economy, this is closer to the Prius Prime, but the Chevy Volt will operate in pure electric mode over a much broader set of operating situations. Ride quality is fairly good in all versions of the Niro, but because the plug-in is using basically the same tires as the base version of the regular hybrid Niro, the ride quality in this model is actually a little bit better than the top-end trim of the regular hybrid, because that model does get slightly lower profile tires and wider tires. So for this particular model, I'm going to have to give this an A. I'd say this ride quality is very similar to some of the smoothest plug-in hybrids in about the same price and size category as the model that we're driving here. Now keep in mind, this is still a small vehicle, so if you're driving out on the highway, on washboard pavement, you still will get a little bit of that rocking backwards and forwards motion, a little bit of bobblehead motion, because the wheelbase in this vehicle is fairly small. That's just something that happens with small vehicles, and it's not unique to the Niro, of course. In our cabin noise test, we scored 72 decibels at 50 miles an hour, which means this is just about the same as the regular Niro. Fairly good for this category, so I'm going to give it a B. When it comes to fuel economy, I'm going to have to give this particular model an A-, and that's because the Prius Prime and the Ioniq are more efficient when operating as an EV or when operating as a hybrid. On the flip side, of course, operating as a hybrid, this is considerably more efficient than the Chevy Volt, and when operating as an electric vehicle, I actually found this to be a little bit more efficient than the Volt in real-world driving, even though the EPA ratings for the electric drivetrain are about the same. Your overall fuel economy will obviously depend on your ability to charge the vehicle, your driving style, and of course the terrain. Since I live in a mountainous area, this vehicle has been getting slightly better fuel economy than I expected because it's able to regenerate power all the way down the hill, and most hybrids' batteries would be completely full by the time I got about a quarter of the way down. And that seems to help compensate for the added weight of the battery pack in the rear. The electric range in the Niro is almost enough for me to drive from home to the office on a complete charge, charge up at the office, and drive almost all the way home on a complete charge. So on that particular cycle, I averaged about 189 miles per gallon. Of course, in that cycle, I didn't just use about a quarter of a gallon of gasoline, I also used 17 kilowatt hours of electricity. So you do have to keep that electricity cost in mind as well. Now, obviously, if you were doing the same trips in a Prius Prime, you would be getting, on average, slightly better fuel economy because the Prius Prime is slightly more efficient. You'll notice when looking at this chart that the trim levels on the Niro plug-in don't line up quite right with the non-plug-in regular hybrid version of the Niro. Things start at $27,900 for the base LX trim. It actually is fairly well equipped, as you can see before you. The model that we were driving was the top-end EX premium trim, which again is not quite the same as what we see over there in the regular Niro. One of the differences between the non-plug-in and the plug-in hybrid is the tire size and the wheel size that we see in this model. Again, this uses the same narrowish tires that we see in the base regular Niro, and that helps improve the economy. Let's talk about comparisons a little bit differently than normal. Plug-in hybrids make for strange bedfellows because plug-in hybrids don't always adhere to the same design philosophy. On the one side, we have vehicles like the BMW i3 and the Chevy Volt, which are more EV with a backup plan than hybrid with a plug. The plus side with this type of design is a long EV range and a vehicle that behaves basically the same when it's operating in hybrid mode or whether it's operating in electric-only mode. The downsides are cost, because both of these are more expensive than other options, and of course the overall fuel economy, especially when operating in hybrid mode, because you're lugging around an awful lot of extra weight that's not doing you any good in that particular mode. The closer you go down that road to the vision of a pure EV with a backup plan, the worse your overall fuel economy seems to get. The Volt really sits sort of on the fence. It actually is a little bit faster when operating as a hybrid than an EV, and that's not what's going on with the BMW i3, of course. And that's logically why the Volt's fuel economy sits sort of on the fence at 42 miles per gallon combined, about 12 less than a Prius Prime. But the BMW i3 gets 35 miles per gallon. On the cost front, the Volt is more expensive than other plug-in hybrids out there, but because of its large battery pack, it does get the full federal EV tax credit of $7,500. That will bring the effective starting price down to $26,595. That sounds a lot more reasonable than the sticker price that you see on the website. The Niro's smaller battery pack means that Kia does not get quite as large of an EV credit, but it starts lower, so the effective lower price of the Niro is $20,357. Now we have to mention that GM's tax credit is expected to start sunsetting around the third quarter of 2018, so your actual tax credit will depend on when you're buying your Volt. When a manufacturer hits a certain number of electric or plug-in hybrid vehicles sold, the EV tax credits start gradually declining until they eliminate completely. So throughout 2019, we expect to see those reduced tax credits, likely also in the fourth quarter of 2018, depending on exactly how many get sold, and then 2020 they should be completely gone. However, because of Kia's lower volume of EVs out on the market and lower volume of plug-in hybrids, we expect to see Kia models like the Niro with that tax credit on the hood well into 2019 and 2020. With that digression taken care of, let's talk about the next category of plug-in hybrids. These are hybrids with the ability to offset some of your fuel consumption from gasoline to electricity. So I would say that this group of hybrid vehicles you shouldn't necessarily look at as an EV with a backup plan. Now, if you really are looking for more of an EV with a backup plan, then obviously this category vehicle is not going to be for you, but this is right for the person that wants excellent fuel economy and wants to be able to offset some of that consumption over to electricity. But these vehicles exist in a spectrum as well. On the one side, closer to something like a Chevy Volt, we have the Honda Clarity. It has a high electric range, relatively good fuel economy, but it doesn't operate quite the same in hybrid and in EV mode. You get less power in the Clarity when operating as an EV, and if you floor the vehicle, it will turn on the gasoline engine. And then on the complete other side of the spectrum, we have vehicles like the Kia Niro, the Hyundai Ioniq plug-in hybrid, in some ways the Prius plug-in as well, and of course the Mini Countryman plug-in hybrid as well. These vehicles are primarily hybrid vehicles, but they allow you to move some of that cost of energy from gasoline over to electricity. All of these vehicles will run on electricity only. However, there's a pretty big difference in performance between the EV mode and the hybrid mode in these particular vehicles. It is much larger of a gap than we see in the Honda Clarity or the Volt, for instance. On the upside, the reduced weight that we see in these vehicles seriously improves fuel economy. And that's why we get the 46 miles per gallon in hybrid mode and 105 mpge in EV mode in the Niro, even though it is shaped like a crossover. It's also how we get the 26 miles of electric range out of a relatively small battery pack. That overall efficiency comparison may not necessarily look too far off the Chevy Volt, but that's because we're comparing a very sleek, sedan-shaped vehicle like the Volt to more of a boxy crossover like the Niro, which has a less aerodynamic shape. So it's actually more true to compare something like the Hyundai Ioniq plug-in hybrid, which has the exact same drivetrain. However, it is installed in a vehicle that is shaped very much like a Chevy Volt. And in that comparison, you can see that this system is definitely more efficient. We get 119 mpge versus 106 mpge in the Volt, 52 miles per gallon in hybrid mode versus 42 miles per gallon in the Volt. But again, these vehicles are not going to operate like the Volt, because if you need to heat the cabin or if you want to climb a hill with more than 60 horsepower, it has to turn on the gasoline engine. And we don't see that in the Chevy Volt. Obviously, one of the big considerations for a plug-in hybrid on this end of the scale is overall operational costs. Let's dive into that right now. The numbers that you're seeing in front of you are from the EPA's fuel economy website, and these are based on the average driving in the US, according to their cycle, and the average fuel and electricity prices in California. You'll notice that the Niro is the most expensive on this list at $900 average operational cost over a 15,000 mile year. That's quite logical, of course, because the Niro is boxier than the other options on this segment, and therefore it's not going to be as aerodynamic. The Volt is actually second in this list because of its overall actual fuel economy. Then we get the Hyundai Ioniq at $800 and, of course, the Prius Prime at $750. The Prius Prime may not have the same EV range as a Chevy Volt, but we're talking about cost of operation here, and cost of operation is definitely lower on the Prius because of its considerably higher gasoline fuel economy. Even though I think it's a real pity that the Niro has to turn on its gasoline engine to heat the cabin in the winter because it doesn't have a heat pump system, I think I would take the Niro over the other options that we've discussed in this group. The first reason for that is the overall price tag. The Niro is incredibly well priced. Again, under $21,000 before destination for that base model after federal tax credit, and under $30,000 for the top-end trim that we've been driving this week with all the gadgets and gizmos that you've seen. The top-end trim is definitely better equipped than a Chevy Volt. It's also more practical than the Volt and the Prius Prime, I think, because of the overall hatchback profile. Now, whether you want to call the Niro a crossover or a tall hatchback, that's really up to you. But whatever you want to call it, this overall form is definitely more practical than the Volt, the Ioniq, or the Prius. I also think that the interior is more comfortable and just generally a nicer place to spend your time than the Volt or the Prius as well. Now, as I said, this is obviously not going to operate as a pure EV for some shoppers out there, so you do need to keep that in mind. If, however, you're looking for a comfortable, practical, and efficient utility vehicle, this is definitely a strong option to consider. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes, and this has been the Niro plug-in hybrid. Be sure and let me know what you think about it down there in the comment section below. Go ahead and find us over at facebook.com/AlexNauta so you can see what we're driving this week. You can also click up at that button at the top of your screen to head over to patreon.com if you want to support this channel, and I hope you do. And I'll see you next week.